And I thought that Bart's description of learning some of those lessons, especially on such a big project early on, was good material for any artist to want to listen to.
Yeah, totally. And also especially his earlier forays with live animals when he had the cows. You have to be kind of a quick study because it's like, where do the cows go at night? What if the cows don't like each other?
Right.
What do we do? Like that's like a legitimate problem. Like, what if the whale doesn't fit in the container and also the cows don't get along? Like it's not gonna work, right? Like the project's not gonna be viable.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the MO podcast, where we interview changemakers in the art and cultural industry who are building big and ambitious projects. My name is Joey Flores. I'm here with my co-host, Jonathan Neal, and back in the quote-unquote studio, we have Rocket Caleshu. Rocket Caleshu is a writer and film producer who has also been working extensively with the artists at Immersion Art. Rocket, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you. So as people might have picked up on, every few episodes, we do a roundtable recap where we talk about the episodes that we recently recorded, kind of opine what was interesting in those episodes, and maybe encourage you to go back and check them out. The most recent 3 episodes we have were the Captain Boomer Collective, which is known for their monumental project called The Whale, which we will get into in a little bit here. And then we had 2 gallerists. We had Chris Sharp of the Chris Sharp Gallery and Anat Ebgi of the Anat Ebgi Gallery. All 3 very interesting interviews. So, Rocket, why don't you just take it away? What jumped out at you about these episodes?
Yeah, totally. It was such a pleasure to get to listen back, and you both asked such good questions. I was like, damn, these are great interviews. I was really struck by I found it really refreshing, honestly, to do the back-to-back with the 2 gallerists, and that it got me really thinking about like sort of like how, I guess, the bigger picture of how like civic engagement around art happens here in the United States versus other places. But I was just so like heartened and refreshed that these 2 like very, very influential, successful and engaged gallerists are able to stay sort of really quite close to their missions, even as they've both grown a lot, and how impressive it is that they're like, yeah, more money does not make it easier to run your business. And that there was just like real, like there was some like really hard won wisdom and insight in how they were sharing about like what it's like to, go from being a really small project or a project that starts at a really economically precarious time, and how that actually can allow you to like do the hard thing and kind of get entrenched in a way of working that's actually really rewarding for you and not just responsive to this question of cash flow, which they both kind of addressed, Chris and Anat, from different angles. But especially just this idea that I was like, having $100 in your bank account sometimes actually makes it easier to actualize things, and how that kind of is almost feels like totally paradoxical to making big projects happen. But this idea of kind of like the reality that like the grit and like the worthiness of the project is what's actually going to make it possible, and the kind of clarity of vision that actually seems to have made both of these gallerists so successful has served them so much more than just like kind of tons of leeway when it comes to space or money, and keeping things small. Yeah, I guess that's like part of what I loved about those 2 was the way that they are like creating civic engagement within the cultural context that tend to reward the collector or the like big name or the acquisition of works more than just the public viewing of works, and that they've kind of both managed to walk that line in a really unique way, that I think is of the time that they're in. It's like Anat was like, well, I don't know, it was 2008. There was a financial crisis. I started a gallery, or Chris being like, I have 100 square feet. It is my living room. What can I do here? And that those constraints actually were the most generative things that seem to have fed big career moves, as opposed to kind of conceiving of those as things that would hinder the growth of their careers and their galleries.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point because it sort of makes you think of rather than saying like, oh, I want to go out and I want to start this gallery, right? And I want to, have 8 shows a year and represent X number of artists, and I'm going to start this thing with that model in mind. It's almost as if they both started like, oh, here is an artist's work, or here's some stuff that I want to show. And I'm going to figure out how to show this material and then get the word out to people that I know and give it a name and begin to put some shape around it as far as a system. And then it grows into, oh, well, this could operate as a gallery, and maybe it can grow into that already existing template, but it doesn't need to begin with that template and be filled in with the various different aspects of it. And I think both Chris and Anat have sort of followed that in an interesting way. I think the other interesting conversation, especially with Chris, was the importance of art fairs for being able to create that kind of distribution system and visibility that one doesn't always have, especially if you're located in a place where he was before Los Angeles, in Mexico City, for example, and how important these fairs were to establishing relationships and visibility and having curators pay attention and having artists and others pay attention. I think that the art fairs have for a long time gotten not a bad rap, but it's like this love-hate relationship, right? People talk about Art Basel, people talk about Frieze. It's like, oh, one has to go. It's a horrible place to see art, but it's very good for collectors, and it's driven by a kind of commercial and market sensibility entirely. But at the same time, you have many, many dealers who look at it as like, but it serves its purpose, and you can do interesting things there. And the whole story about Chris showing up to NADA in Miami with figurative work at a time when no one was paying attention to figuration, at the kind of height of zombie formalism as it then came to be known, and how that was, people were kind of unable to see what was going on. And then, of course, 3 to 4 years later, figuration is basically all that anybody can talk about or can show or can sell. I thought was pretty interesting. And the art fair environment was the environment in which that kind of conversation began to take place.
I think it's interesting because the problems that you alluded to and the beef that people have with the art fairs is that sort of like sometimes that commercialism where you walk in, you see something, you're like this is just like clearly like a money grab, and I also don't like resonate with this work or whatever, and I think that can be certain types of gallerists who are maybe more market minded, but the two gallerists we spoke with, both Chris and Anat, are like they started these projects really small. They, really just focus on picking interesting work and interesting artists. They look at these art fairs as a way to gain, to get 3,000 people to see an artist they think deserves to be seen. And of course, they want to make a return, and they need to think about that, to some extent. But I think maybe the reason why they aren't so jaded about the art fairs is because they tend to like focus on bringing a number of works by the same artist and really giving that person a platform for like broader exposure. And so maybe it's just the fact that like they just tend to have this more genuine approach to the way that they're working with artists, and the way that they're presenting artists is why perhaps they still actually like enjoy the fairs. Whereas a lot of people who kind of have gotten past their enjoyment of the fairs, it's perhaps either because they're seeing a lot of people who don't take that genuine approach, or they themselves are not able anymore to take a genuine approach, and so it sort of feels soul sucking. Whereas for Chris, it hasn't turned into that.
I think that you also, this is a way of kind of rationalizing what happens at different scales, right? So I think it's very interesting, with Rocket, where you're talking about how it's very refreshing to hear about the kind of decisions you make when there's no money in the bank account. They're decisions you have to make when you do have a larger space or multiple spaces around the country, and you've got a payroll that you've got to keep, and you've got utilities and shipping costs and everything else that have to be fed. And this is in my previous academic moment, this might have been a research project that I was interested in doing. I'm certainly not going to do it now, so somebody else should take it up. But it's like, what scale of gallery, at what scale of budget does one now need to start arriving to the art fair with the kind of selection of work that is going to appeal to the collector base that one has already developed? It's no longer a solo artist presentation, which can be a huge risk for a gallery, because it's like, as with collectors, some things hit, some things don't, right? It's like, so if you have only one artist and a range of work by one artist that you bring to a fair, it might be great for visibility, and it's awesome for a smaller gallery who's trying to introduce someone to a marketplace and to curators and to a larger audience. You get 3,000 people eyes on this thing in person. It's a great opportunity. But if you've got to keep the lights on, you've got to have something for everybody to a certain extent. And so now that's what you end up seeing in the kind of big booths at Frieze and Art Basel and these other places, where it's like they've got 15 artists and 15 works by 15 artists, and it's a new work by each of those people. And they're really just trying to match those sensibilities up to the collector sensibility, to the consumer mind. And you can't begrudge them. It makes for a less compelling presentation often, but you can't blame them, right? And it's interesting to see at what level gallery can still, maybe there's like this like uncanny valley in between or something like that, where it's like, the galleries that are really sort of needing to make their payrolls are doing the buffet effect. And then once you're Gagosian, you can afford to do a single installation by Chris Burden in a Frieze art fair at the center of the fair, and you're really looking for an institution to buy that thing, and maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't, but it's like, that's a risk, but it's a risk you can take when there's enough capital standing behind those things. So even at the top and the bottom levels, there's a certain amount of freedom, and in the middle, it's where you get stretched. The middle class is always getting stretched. It's just a war on the middle class, is what it is. It's a war on the middle class.
It totally is, though. It's also just like, okay, but something I appreciated about both of them is that they, build long-term relationships with their artists, and that's part of, kind of the stated mission. And I think that with the younger artists, it's like obviously protecting them from the volatility of the market is actually part of your responsibility. Like if you're going to build a long-term relationship with a young artist or emerging artist as a gallerist, it's like you do have to buffet the volatility for them somewhat. So it was like when Anat was talking about like, a painter selling a work for $6,000, and then a year later it's selling an auction for $100K, and then the year after that it resale value $50K. It's like, well, that's still a huge leap in 2 years, but it's like to be able to manage that kind of risk as like an individual artist is quite challenging, right? Just even like psychologically, it's such a bizarre game. And so I appreciated this real commitment to a bottom line of like a long-term career for both the artist and the gallerist, and that is going to maybe change how you distribute risk a little bit, and that you might have to have more like buffets at the fairs, but that it's with the goal of trying to create some kind of sustainability within the volatility.
100%. I think it'd be like, difficult not to try to capitalize on, like a trend in the market, right? And over the past like 4 years in particular, there's just been like a massive shift where a lot of work that was underappreciated in the past became appreciated, and then, dare I say, overappreciated. And you had a lot of work that was not particularly unique or interesting, that because it fell into a certain type of work, was just popular. I don't think there's longevity there, but so it's interesting to think about, okay, well, now I was going from making things for $5,000, but suddenly what I make is very hot, and it may have a lot more to do with trends than it has to do necessarily with, a recognition of me. But, I can now sell my works for $25,000, $30,000, $40,000. It would be very, difficult not to sort of like take advantage of that moment. But when you ride those sort of trend waves, and we see this in the startup world, where like, AI companies raising at like massive valuations. And then, at some point, people will get used to AI and realize that machine learning is like, has been in apps everywhere. And like, everybody's just using that buzzword because it was like really popular. But that now we're starting to look at like the fundamentals of these businesses. And all of a sudden there's like a price correction. I think it's actually probably easier to handle that in the startup world. I mean, nobody likes a down round, but it is what it is. In the art world, it kind of feels like if you took advantage of that trend and hiked your prices up to $40,000, and then the trend sort of settles down, and there's just not an appetite for as much work at those prices. As we all know, I mean, that can just destroy artists' careers. I do think that, it would be a tough job as a gallerist to be like, hey, listen, I get it. We could sell these things for $40,000, $50,000, but let's keep our eye on the long term. And I think I think that's where having a super thoughtful and mindful gallerist like Chris and Anat, I think that's the difference between them and maybe some people who, again, more market minded, less worried about the long term. Hey, let's fleece the golden goose while we can, or whatever it is. So I think, yeah, those are tough challenges to navigate. But I think Chris and Anat just seem like they approach these things, I think, just with good intentions, right? Like as opposed to opportunistic intentions.
And also with each of them, it seems so driven by their own particular research interests as like thinkers. And I think that just obviously makes all the difference. And that they both seem like they continue to work pretty close to whatever their kind of like, academic or research interests are. And that grounds how they make decisions. And Chris mentioned that. He was like, well, yeah, if you can't trust your own intuition, it's going to be very hard when you actually have to make decisions where there is not one clear correct choice. If you don't have an orientation that you're working from, you are going to get thrown asunder by what you think the market is going to want to do. And that seems like a recipe for bumming the artists out too.
Yeah. I also appreciated Anat's just brass tacks, everything is negotiable, right? And teaching that to the people who work at the gallery is that, listen, everything can be negotiated, especially prices, costs for whatever is going on, and realizing that pushing on all of those expenses and not just accepting that the cost is the cost, but that you could, find something better, probably is exhausting, but adds up, right? It's one of those things. It's just it's a overall cost saving measure, and makes it so that, maybe at the end of the year, the balance sheet is each year is a little bit better. And then over time, that just creates the cushion that you need to be able to do the projects that you want to be able to do. Right. So it was a good lesson.
We've seen firsthand here, like how absolutely insane shipping costs have become. And so, that was one of the specific costs that she said that she's seen the highest rise in, and that those things are negotiable. I don't know that we've really, I think we get multiple quotes, but then we take the quote and so, like, push hard on those things. I think because you just assume that like it's a shipping cost. I mean, it is the cost that it is, right? But it makes sense that, companies would pad that with a little extra margin, and that there's got to be some room there. I think that goes back to what they were saying about, when you start out with no money, and you need to get things done, you have to ask for that extra, listen, we can't afford that. Like, can you do better? And I think if you start out with more money or in a hot market or whatever else, you don't instill in yourself and your team and your company like that sort of scrappy, need to save every dollar. You say, oh, okay, the cost is what it is, and you end up spending that money. So I think it's like, again, goes back to this idea that like starting scrappy just forces you to do things that, in the long run, if they become part of your MO, part of your MO.
We need like a bell, bell that rings every time you use something that says MO.
Yeah. I would like it on the TV show when, like, Family Guy, when he says he's a family guy and they acknowledge that they like kind of, but yeah.
We need like a, we're like,
the other thing I found interesting about this, like, sort of starting scrappy thing that was interesting to me is, both Lulu and Anat's, first attempt at a gallery, they were more project spaces than they were galleries, right? And they both started out of, like, let's call it free space, right? Like, they didn't go lease some space. Lulu was started out of a living room, and Anat said, somebody gave her some space to work with, including a garage that she said she totally capitalized on. She said, I used all of it, everything that I could. And, so I think there's like, there's so many lessons just for entrepreneurship in general in these episodes, but like specifically for anybody who's interested in opening a project space or a gallery. It's like, starting out super scrappy, you don't need a lot of money, like it really comes down to the selection of great art and great artists,
For sure. The thing about space, the thing about real estate, I think, is an interesting one. I've been thinking more about it, just like, and it's not a shocker, right? You talk to anybody who's been involved in this for a long time. There are a lot of funding agencies and other nonprofits and people who are involved, not just in the visual art world, but in the arts and cultural space in general, who've been very engaged in figuring out how do arts organizations get and to own their buildings or to own their physical plant? How do you figure out how to create, spaces, subsidized or otherwise, where people can kind of do this work? Because the work actually has to be done in some sort of physical space, right? We know tons of artists trying to find studios. One of the reasons why Los Angeles became such an interesting mecca for artists is because, you could get a small 1,200 square foot or 1,000 square foot house, and it had a garage, right? Or it had like a space on the property that could be turned into a studio, right? So you could walk out your back door and like be at work. And that, there was a huge difference from my days in New York where, you'd trek up to the Bronx or out to the farther reaches of Brooklyn, and you'd have these old industrial buildings that had been chopped up by some enterprising landlord into studios, 15, 20 to a floor, hastily put up, wood, or drywall hallways with, cheap doors or whatever. But it's like, there were a lot of artists who needed just some sort of physical space, and that was the way to do it. And so, even from the sort of gallery standpoint, from the commercial sector, everyone's like, oh, you're a gallery, you can sell, and, it makes it easy. But the real estate really is the thing that makes it very difficult to make these things happen. So anytime someone gets access to a free space, it's just like, that's, certainly for a startup operation in the arts and cultural space, like a dance troupe or a gallery, that's going to be your biggest expense, because at that point too, you're just not going to have HR expenses, right? You're not going to have personnel. It's going to be you. It's going to be people doing basically volunteer. You might have one person coming in part-time. It's like, that's not going to be a huge expense for you, but the space is going to start off being the big expense. So if you can figure that out first and then, build everything up from there, you'd be in better shape. And there'd probably have to be more models for how to create physical space for artists, and I just don't know what those might be right now.
It's interesting. So I've been in Mexico, a lot over the past several years, but I've now been in Oaxaca for 5 months. And yesterday I was walking, and there was a dance troupe practicing in a public square. And it was like, clearly they're all wearing like, kind of a uniform shirt and whatever else. But, they're out like literally on like basically what amounted to like almost like just a large sidewalk, like a really large sidewalk. And this isn't the first time I've seen that. I saw a dance troupe in Guadalajara practicing, on the front plaza of a bank on Sunday when it was closed. And, I'm sure they meet there every week. And, they practice dancing, in this like free space that nobody. I think in America you would never go like, oh, I'm gonna go dance in the Chase parking lot. Like that just doesn't happen, right? But these people are like getting it done. And I took this tour, and I was telling you guys about this before then we hit record, of various artisans in the Oaxaca region. And I was taking this tour yesterday, and there was these guys who make like metal sculptures out of tin, a lot of cutting and different stuff, and they make like decorative whatever. And we were in this place, and it feels very run down, right? Like the wall is like wallpapered with like old, product wrappers, and like it's very, very Mexican. And I was walking through, and at first I was kind of thinking like, this space is just sort of like run down, and they've been probably using this like this for many years. And I don't know, I was having sort of these like judgmental thoughts about like this like space. And then at some point I go, dude, you're casting shade on this guy. He's got 3 massive rooms in which he's able to make these sculptures. He's got all this like equipment and all of these things. And, I'm struggling to find like, a place in my apartment where I can paint for more than a few hours before like the natural light isn't strong enough. And, he's got the space figured out. I mean, and, those other things are not important, right? Like this guy, this is what he does for a living. His kids help him with this. It's a family business, and they have like a massive amount of space in which to operate. Like, who cares that, like some of the walls they're not like polished the way we would expect, in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And I just think, it again comes down to doing a lot with a little. And, this guy's been, doing this his whole life and is able to support, a bunch of kids with this practice. And that's actually what matters, right? Like the ability to do the craft, not necessarily like have the most luxurious space in which to do it.
Right.
What do you we can always come back to the gallerists, but I mean, how freaking cool is The Whale by Captain Boomer Collective? I mean, so I guess we should talk about it first, so in case anybody hasn't heard the episode yet. But Bart Van Peel from the Captain Boomer Collective, they have they mount a 50-meter replica of a beached whale. In the dark of night, they land on a beach somewhere, whether it's like a river outlet towards the sea or whatever, somewhere where a whale might reasonably be. And they show up in the middle of the night. They mount this 50-meter whale replica. They bring with them buckets of rotting fish, or, in some cases, even whale blubber, and make sure that it smells like it should smell. They fence it off. They dress up as scientists. They collect samples from the whale, and they use this to spark conversations about conservation and man's impact on the environment, and plastic in the ocean, and global warming, and all of these things. They get all kinds of reactions, including kudos from Greenpeace, or drug addicts jumping up on the whale and being very pissed that they've been misled into believing there's a real whale there. Anyway, so that's what the whale is. But what did you guys think about that episode and that project?
I was particularly intrigued by this line that is being walked between the real and the fake. I think the team and Bart's sort of allegiance to not kind of to playing the roles and playing the part without being dishonest in a way too is like was a curious one. But there's a real kind of fine line being walked by mounting this installation and giving it all of the accoutrements to try and make people believe in its veracity, intentionally misleading anybody or lying about anything specifically to anybody or when they ask questions about it, right? But I think it's particularly in a moment of kind of spectacular events and things that are sort of designed to circulate through social media channels in order to gain their visibility or to gain their purchase in the discourse. I thought it's that piece of it was very interesting to me, even outside of the sort of broader just conversation that they're trying to stimulate about climate change, conservation, et cetera. This tricky territory between real and the fake, right? The information and disinformation, valid and the invalid is, I think today, like, even though it's not central to the project, is like a really interesting place to be occupying and seeing how it goes.
Totally. One of my first questions when I was listening was like, what if they went in on it as a deep fake and just pretend that they were real, scientists? How would that, it would obviously change the performative relationship between the audience and the artist essentially, but also what a curious thing, because it seems like would that really shift people's reaction to it or the way that people engage with it if they just sort of proceeded apace as if they were scientists and
right.
sort of didn't field questions as in the same way, didn't field questions that acknowledged the nature of the project? Would that actually change how people interacted with it? Would it change people's takeaways around the questions they're raising?
Yeah.
I wonder.
Yeah, it's like trompe l'oeil. It's like this thing that's been designed to fool the eye and to put on display the skill and the capacity of the artist to make something that is or appears like the thing itself, such that it walks up to this moment of tricking you, but yet, you think of like old 19th century trompe l'oeil paintings. It's like, but as the viewer, you can still walk to the side and you still are in on the fact that it's an artifice and no one is truly taken in, or even if you're taken in for a moment, it doesn't catch you out and make you feel stupid, right? If anything, it's like you are privy to the artist's, talents and the capacities to create this thing. And so what they've done is they've created this kind of like three-dimensional experiential trompe l'oeil, right? And the artist is never sitting there when it's a trompe l'oeil painting being like, no, that's a real dollar bill. Like, no, like really, it's like it's not genuinely trying to create a counterfeit. You know what I mean? It's like, it's not a counterfeit. You're always, as the audience, it respects the audience enough to always have them be sort of in on what's happening. But it's such a mimesis, right? There's such a high fidelity to the thing being real that you are able to sort of be wowed by it, right? And I think that's an interesting kind of territory. It's like, how do you create experience for people that does, to a certain extent, sort of like trick them without duping them, right? It's like the difference between tricked and being duped, or like, or being, there's some fine line there that it's not at the audience's expense, right? Like it's which is like deepfakes and everything else are trying to make you believe something that's not real, right?
Yeah. And I think a big piece, and I think a big piece of how they achieve that is through the the experiential component of
Right.
it. That it's not like it's not like you are like, I'm looking at a giant stuffed animal whale, like that there
Right.
is that there is some there's an investment in the audience's experience, and that sort of, I guess, generosity to what
Yeah.
it is that a passerby would be drawn in towards, is a hugely important component to creating like a dialogue, as opposed to some kind of like it's transgressive because there's like fake guts or whatever, but like but it's not trying to toy with an audience or
Right.
create disrespect there. It's actually trying to like elevate respect while acknowledging that, like, of course there's like a false element to it, because
Right.
we don't want there to
Right.
actually be a real dead whale,
Right. Exactly. The artifice and the audience being able to acknowledge the artifice is essential to the work being read the right way.
Yeah.
Well, our listeners won't know this yet unless I did tease it on LinkedIn, but our next episode is with Jewel, who everybody knows Jewel from her legendary music career, but she's got an exhibition up at Crystal Bridges right now in Arkansas, which includes a 10-minute 200 drone light show to some music of hers. And what's interesting to me about these two projects is that they are both, to me, using awe to really give people an experience, but it's like, it's not awe for awe's sake, right? It's like, both of them have do for the audience, right? So, with Bart, it's all about starting a conversation, making people think about, seeing a beached whale. I mean, that's a very emotional experience, right? And then, allowing people to process that, what's going on here, and what's happening in the world, that this massive animal has died on land, and all these things, but then to be sort of, brought back to, a place of like, okay, just reflection now, because now you realize it's not real, and you're able to like take a step back and say, okay, all right, like let me set aside the initial emotions that I had, and like, and think more about this from, a different standpoint. And then with Jules' project, she very much wants you to sort of like, I guess there's an aspect of wanting you to reflect on some things, and sort of like, sit with yourself, and it's supposed to be kind of a calming experience, despite the fact that there's 200 drones flying above you. A big part of it, and the music that is there is meant to, bring you, I don't know, to center you in some way, or something like that. And so anyways, it's just interesting, as opposed to, maybe walking into a place and just seeing like a really massive work that's, looks very complex, and you're like, wow, that's like really impressive from a construction standpoint, or some other aspect. But and it gets a reaction out of you, but not necessarily designed to walk you through some sort of personal journey in any way, which I think with these two different projects, that's pretty interesting to me, to use something so big to then allow people to go through a bit of a personal journey.
No, I think that's right. I also just appreciate the ambition of it, right? It was like, oh, let's like make this like, let's do this guerrilla action with this like enormous whale, and just thinking of through the logistics, right? Like, oh, we need to, in the mistakes that they made, like, well, when we did the first whale, it was just a little bit larger than a container, and so it'd have to be shipped in two pieces when we needed to move it. Like, the next whale we built was like built to the specifications of like a standard shipping container size, which made it easier to, the thoughts made it easier to move around and present this thing. So, and that's certainly one of those things that you realize like is hard won knowledge, right? It's like there is this, there is a world out there of preset capacities, right? And it doesn't mean that you have to accord yourself or conform to everybody else's standards and you can't be creative. But at a certain point, there's a sense of like, all right, we want this thing to be effective and we want to get the most out of it. Let's think, how big is the door frame? before I, make a certain size canvas, right? Like how big is the elevator? How am I going to get this thing out of the studio before I embark on, the epic painting project in my studio just because I've got, 12 feet by 10 feet and I can do it, right? And that's one of the things I've like been most appreciative, especially artists who've been at this for a long time. You see these things and you're like, they thought through like, oh, this monumental canvas breaks down to these component parts, all fits within a, certain space so we can ship it super easily, right? Like all basically stacks up together. Or the sculpture, comes apart in these 6 places and here's how the stuff is all attached together. And, all like, I have a deep appreciation for those kinds of behind the scenes logistics fixes that are thought of in advance. And I thought that Bart's description of learning some of those lessons, especially on such a big project early on, was good material for any artist to want to listen to.
Yeah, totally. And also especially his earlier forays with live animals when he had the cows and like what he learned about like having to like working with live talent and then obviously there's a kind of care that you have to bring to that when you're dealing with a sentient being, but that care also follows through when you're just working at a big scale. And that like so many, I think part of like working on big projects is that they're collaborative in nature and that they implicate a lot of different people. And so like being able to do them in the smartest way possible is like a form of care, because it's otherwise a waste of people's time and resources. And I really appreciate that about what they're doing, because it seems like their investment in their messaging is real and is strong. And so they're like, it actually would go against what we're trying to do if we like couldn't work smart, and that like if we're like making commentary on climate change and on like the changing sort of like social and cultural norms around conservation, that if we do this in a careless way, it's not going to reflect that messaging. And that you have to learn stuff kind of like you have to be kind of a quick study, because it's like, where do the cows go at night? What if the cows don't like each other? What, like that's like a legitimate problem. Like what if the whale doesn't fit in the container and also the cows don't get along? Like it's not going to work, right? Like the project's not going to be viable.
Yeah, it's an interesting. Go ahead, Joy.
I was just, like going back to what you said about, needing to like some things you have to learn over time. And then, Rocket, your comment, it was interesting to me that they had to use local cows because of disease and other things, right? And so, this is not some traveling road show where like, you get to know these cows, they get to know you and whatever else. So like every project, every time they did this was a little bit different, and they had to like source a farmer and they had to do these things. And, these are just like interesting lessons to have learned, or things that, I'm sure when you embark on this, you're like, hey, of course, probably the first time you're in Antwerp and, you're local to the area, you're just going to get local cows. But then you're like, let's go do this in another city. And I don't know that it dawns on you right away that like, you can't take these cows and travel them to, other places, even if logistically it's possible, it's not safe, or it's not, it's not sanitary or whatever it is. So I think that that's interesting. And I also think, when you talk about the messaging, Rocket, I'll just say it, as somebody who's been vegan for 20 years, sometimes, you can be heavy handed thinking that you want to spread a message a little bit. And I think it's cool that like, Bart does these things and wants you to think about things, but they don't tell you what to think. It doesn't seem like it, they're not like hammering some message, and it's not, they do the cow thing. They incorporate farmers. They want you to think about farming and the impact on the animals and all of these things, but they do it in such a thoughtful and open way that they get farmers interested in participating. And I think that's, that brings more authenticity to it. It allows people who maybe, would normally like land on one side of an issue to feel like they can come and experience that, because multiple sides are represented, and then they still have an opportunity then to think about things from more than just their normal angle, right? Like, so the way that they sort of bring a lot of different thoughts and people and advocates of different types into the conversation. I think that's really interesting. I think it would be really tempting to just say like, oh, here's my view, and how do I really hammer that home with this exhibition? And they don't do that. They're really careful to make sure that it's asking questions more than it is providing answers sometimes. But I think like getting back to the logistics of like the whale and like, again, it the day that you realize this thing doesn't fit on a shipping container and you spent $200,000 making it, I think that's a rough day. Just like kudos, like building a $200,000 replica whale, and thinking about the smell. It just makes you think like, I don't know what ambitions artists have, but you have no excuses, right? Like, I mean, if Bart Van Peel and his team can build a 50-meter whale replica that smells like fish guts, you can certainly make this sculpture you've been thinking about, or whatever it is. So, it's exciting to see somebody just, I don't know, just go for it with something so crazy. I mean, when does the thought hit you? You know what? Let's build a replica whale and actually just install it on the beach. And just even having that creativity and that thought is one thing. To actually decide, I'm going to do it. I mean, let's not just talk about it. Let's do this, and let's raise the money. Yeah. Let's get the permits. Let's put this thing on a truck, and then find out that trucks don't drive in sand very well. All of those things. Props to Bart for
space and time seem to be like the biggest assets that you need to have to pull these things off. I just think about like someone basically saying like, okay, let's make a 50-meter like let's make this huge whale, and then you're like, okay, but when am I going to be able to do that? Where am I going to do this? And like, listen, there was this was, and I think that, one of the last times that I had this kind of spare time, and which is often why you see like startups and these other businesses happen when people are in their like 20s, or someone starts a gallery when they're 20s or these types of things, because it's like, that's a moment when you just like, you have a lot of unspoken for time.
Energy.
Yeah, and energy. Like even in college, so I went to architecture school at Cornell, and there's this tradition where the architects would build this, this big life-size dragon. And it was called Dragon Day. I can't remember, but it takes place like, I think at the very end of the fall semester, if not early in the spring semester, but so it's like wintertime. But we built and it happens every year, but we built this like mobile sculpture, like the type of thing you'd see at a Burning Man DIY, but probably not as nice as the things that they make at Burning Man these days, but this huge thing that like all these students basically pitched in time, energy, and resources and constructed this, probably 2-story tall thing that like someone tried to figure out how to make it actually like breathe fire, getting I mean, this is in the 90s, so there were probably fewer regulations, but, and the thing was on this big wheeled chassis, and we had access to to welding equipment, and so we welded this whole thing together, and people cut out these cardboard scales, and the thing was enormous, and then you push it through the campus, and then eventually like burn it on the quad, right? And it's just like this big festival. I look back at it now and I'm like, it was great fun. It was an amazing piece of work, and it was totally an expenditure of energy and resources, never to be really sort of captured or stored or archived or anything like that. But so it's just like a testament to like just having time to dedicate to this type of stuff, right? You could like go to class, you could do your work, and then you'd have like 5 hours, like after class, 5 p.m., like even more, like, there's like, that's what you were doing. You were hanging out, you were building these things. It was this social engagement type of thing. And you realize like the Captain Boomer Collective and Bart's enterprise is as much about the people and the sort of the community that's created to make the thing, right? When everybody sort of comes together, and a lot of it's volunteering their time to do it. And it has a very sort of informal arrangement to it. And then, as it begins to take more shape, things need to get a little bit more formalized. You need to raise money. It needs to become its own kind of organization. Like, infrastructure is required to have this thing persist through time. But at those early stages, it's just this kind of collaborative, collective effort that people are excited to see happen, and so they're willing to put the time in that they have when you have it to give.
Well, I'm curious from our audience, anybody listening, do you like these roundtable episodes? Are these interesting as well to you? Please shoot us a note. Let us know if you have thoughts on that. You can find our contact information on the Inversion Art website. I am super excited to release the Jewel episode next week. That was definitely a really engaging talk. Jewel is a hell of a painter. I mean, it's pretty incredible. So anyways, yeah, I'm looking forward to releasing that episode. And let's see, do we have any, more opinions, questions that we want to throw in on the end of this? I mean, we've kind of done that, but if you had to, suddenly join any of the three teams that we put in these last three episodes, would you want to work at the Chris Sharp Gallery, the Anat Ebgi Gallery, or be part of the Captain Boomer Collective? Rocket, you go first.
I'm getting out there with the whale for sure.
Yeah.
I'm rattling the cattle. I'm wrangling the cattle. That's what I want to do. I want to wrangle the cattle.
It's hard to pick sides, but I will say I've known Chris as a critic for a long time. I appreciate, so I stop by his gallery and we have conversations all the time about the work, and I think I could spend a year hanging out with Chris's gallery and getting to know it and helping that project along. Not that he needs my help. Not that it doesn't needs any help either. But I just think Chris and I have an ongoing dialogue that would be interesting to continue.
For some reason, kind of felt like you were going to say that, and I think it works out wonderfully because I just love Anat's energy, and as artistic as I am, I think I love being a part of the business world as well. And I think I would love to go make some things happen with Anat. I think her comments about the auction reactions and people responding to auction prices, stuff like that. I just think she's got an energy that I think would be a lot of fun to be around. So there we go. We all go our
perfect
there and
very equitable.
Yeah. Awesome. Rocket, thank you as always for joining us in the roundtable.
Thank you for having me.
Excited to share the Jewel episode with you and do another roundtable once you've checked that one out. And Jonathan, it's always good to see you.
All right.
Okay. Bye.